As we watch the news every day, we see a lot of different things going on with the world economy and concerns about inflation and recession and all sorts of things like that. And I was thinking this morning about what makes the middle class. And we've always heard about the middle class. Well, certainly those of us who live in the United States have. It's a very commonly used phrase. And within that, we also talk about the lower middle class and the upper middle class. And that's a bit interesting because we haven't really dissected what those things mean. We just sort of think we know. We think we know when we see it. So maybe if I was to say to the average person, what do you think is the upper middle class and what do you think is the lower middle class? What is the middle class? Well, people would say, well, maybe the middle class is kind of everyday people that are doing okay in life and they're able to have a house in a neighborhood and they are secure in their jobs or their careers so that they're not worried about meeting everyday necessities. And that would be probably kind of the general idea. Now, if I said what's the difference between the upper middle class and the lower middle class, then quite probably most people would say, well, the upper middle class is sort of the kind of bigger houses. They're not mansions or anything extremely lavish, but they're pretty nice houses. And they're the people who have, like the newest model vehicles. And maybe they have two nice new cars in the driveway and they have, that pretty expensive house and they have, postgraduate education and they are making, pretty good money and they're just overall, they're more in, like maybe they're each individual person in the household is making over $100,000, for example, maybe something like that. In the lower middle class, we would say, well, maybe they're more of the people that live in the decent houses, but they're smaller, they're older, they're the more affordable kind of places that aren't really as flashy and maybe they drive more of a used car or something that's a little bit older model or something. And maybe they're more blue collar. Maybe they're not, they're doing okay. They're not struggling. They're not suffering, but they're maybe they make $50,000 a year. Maybe the spouse works. Maybe they got like $100,000 a year between the two of them, and they're able to make ends meet. They're doing okay, but they're not visibly displaying as good of a quality of life as what we would consider to see normally for the upper middle class. All right, so something like that. That's kind of fair. But the truth is, that's not really how it works. Truth is, the lower middle class is the people who live in a way that looks like it's the middle class, in the sense that they have the house that looks pretty good and they have the cars that look pretty good. Overall, their life looks like it's the picture of some sort of a middle class way of life. But if you look a little bit below the surface, the cars they have are not paid off and they're underwater on the mortgage, and maybe they're making $100,000 or $150,000 a year or something, but the truth is they're living paycheck to paycheck. They're just one tragedy away from kind of losing all of it. And if they lost their job, that means they can't actually pay the mortgage and they're going to lose their house. It doesn't mean that they're going to be able to, like somebody who paid off their house, just know that they're going to be okay regardless. It's that fundamental foundation below the surface that actually separates the lower middle class from the upper middle class. And there's a lot of upper middle class people who might drive an older model car or they might live in a simpler home, but they've got it paid off or they've got themselves set up to where they have enough of a nest egg of investments and other things going on to where they don't actually need to go to work. They could quit their job and go find another one, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. They are going to be able to probably retire comfortably, because by the time they reach 65, they're going to be able to fully pay off their home, and then all they're going to have to do is pay tax on the property, things like that. So really, the upper middle class is the group of people who live within their means, while the lower middle class are the people who are much more hand to mouth. Maybe they have the appearance of being middle class, but below the surface, there's not really much of a foundation. And it's the difference between people who build their house out of stone and people who build it out of sand. And when the tide comes in, you can see what remains and what gets washed out. And I think as we look at the prospect of adversity making its way into the world, because the truth is we have lived in a time of great blessing and abundance, what you'll find is that there are people who are always going to subsist, and they live as very poor people who maybe are there through misfortune, but more likely are there because of their own personal lifestyle choices. And I couldn't tell you how many people I've seen who somehow managed to find money for liquor and casual drugs, but they struggle to find money to fix the broken parts on their vehicle or something like that. That's lifestyle choices. That has nothing to do with how much money you make. It has to do with what your priorities are. But there's other reasons why people wind up in the lower class, and sometimes it really truly is beyond someone's control, and a tragedy has happened or something. But even that normally when something bad happens and you have no safety net, it's not really just that thing. It's also that in good times you didn't actually have any discipline to put anything away or plan in advance for the bad times, even though you would have rationally had cause to know that in good times you're going to have bad times that follow, and you should be preparing. You shouldn't just be spending everything you have all the time without any thought of that. In any case, the thing is, what's interesting is that when times get quite challenging for people in general, what happens is that the lower middle class, and again, remember, we're not talking about people who are living a simpler life. We're talking about people who aren't really living within their means. They have a middle class lifestyle, but they don't have the foundation to back it. Well, those people, they are the ones who wind up losing their homes and losing their way of life and having to give up a lot of those things that they have become accustomed to. And then they join the ranks of the lower classes. Now, the lower classes, they're not affected because they always had been lower classes and they always will be. But the catch is, when the people who had been living beyond their means fall into the ranks of the lower classes, the entire system that gives everyone their, if you will, hand-to-mouth subsistence salary, that all kind of falls apart, because you only have so much subsidized housing and so many handouts to give and things of that nature. So it's kind of like, when you go to the emergency room in good times, it's no big deal. You are going to get care, and they're not going to turn you away. But if you have an extreme situation happen, then the system will be overwhelmed, and then no one's going to get taken care of. Not the people who were always there, nor the new people. No one's going to have the chance to be taken care of because there's just not enough to go around. And that's where it's very important to think about not what is your quality of life, not what is your standard of living, but what are you doing to be a good steward of your blessings when you have good times, when you have abundance. Because if you don't figure out how to live within your means in good times, there will come a time when you find yourself doing quite poorly. And I think it's even worse. For people who have always kind of lived in a rough situation, it's no surprise. But for people who have thought that they're better than that, who've always lived with this idea that it's not going to happen to me, those people, when the house of cards falls over, they're going to be extremely disappointed in a very special way. And I think for all of us, it's important to take some time and do a little bit of soul searching and budget balancing and things like that, and really question yourself and say, where do I fall in all of this? And if the answer is, I don't know that I'm necessarily in a good place, then start cutting back on some of those things that are going to hinder you. Even if they make you look good and feel good in the short term, give them up now so that you have something to fall back on later. Thanks.